Afternoon, everybody. Hello.
You're here only because you didn't win the lottery last night.
Yes, that is exactly right. Didn't even come close. I assume it's the same. You could say the same for all of you. I do have quite a bit to start with, so I just ask your forbearance that there's quite a bit I want to get to at the top, and then obviously we'll get right at it. I think you've seen, or I hope you've seen, the statement that I put out about the terrorist attack in Jakarta. I just would like to reiterate here that the United States strongly condemns today's terrorist attack in Jakarta. And again, we extend our condolences to all those who are affected by it. We stand firmly with the Indonesian people against terrorism and extremist ideologies that fuel and give rise to this kind of violence. And as you may have seen, as Secretary Kerry said this morning in London, we join international condemnation of this attack. And as he also said, acts of terror are not going to intimidate nation states. We're going to stand together, all of us, united in our efforts to eliminate those who choose terror as a tactic. We're going to continue to obviously work with our Indonesian partners and others around the world to combat these shared threats. In addition to the attacks in Indonesia, I do want to note that we also strongly condemn yesterday's terrorist bombings in Diyarbakir in Turkey, and extend our condolences again to all those who are affected, killed, and wounded, as well as their family and friends. Turkey is a friend and a NATO ally, and we will continue to stand with the Turkish people as they continue to deal with very real terrorist threats on their soil. You probably saw that the Defense Department announced today the transfer of 10 Yemeni nationals from Guantanamo to Oman. This transfer marks an important milestone. For the first time since 2002, the detainee population now at the facility at Guantanamo Bay is under 100. In fact, with this transfer, it takes it down to 93. Reaching this milestone is in large part due to the sustained diplomatic engagement here at the State Department, led by our Special Envoy, Lee Wolosky, and his team. We're especially grateful to our friends and allies for their continued support of our efforts to close the detention facility. Since 2009, 24 different countries, most recently Ghana, and of course today Oman, have resettled 92 detainees who are not their nationals and who could not return to their home countries, and more than a dozen other countries who have received their nationals from Guantanamo. So we're going to continue to engage with friends and allies around the world as we work to close the detention facility. Their assistance is critical to achieving our shared goal of doing just that. I do want to note also that today, following President Obama's phone call with Russian President Putin yesterday, the Secretary did speak today over the phone with Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov. They mostly talked about Syria and Ukraine. The Secretary and the Foreign Minister agreed that UN-led negotiations between the Syrian parties must move forward as scheduled on January 25th in Geneva and without preconditions. They also agreed that steps must be taken to foster a productive discussion between all the Syrian parties in advance of the meeting. The Secretary again expressed his deep concern over attacks on civilians by Russian and regime military forces, and encouraged Russia to use its influence with the regime to permit the unfettered access of organizations delivering vital humanitarian aid to the Syrian people, particularly in besieged and hard-to-reach places. I would note today, as I think you probably have seen, we are aware of another convoy reaching Madaya and a couple of other towns as well. So that's encouraging, but we've got to see it continue, and they did talk about that today. On Ukraine, the Secretary and Foreign Minister Lavrov both underscored the importance of full implementation of the Minsk Agreement by all parties. And they agreed to continue this dialogue that they have had and to meet more specifically in Zurich on the 20th of this month. I do want to also talk, speaking about meetings, a U.S. delegation led by Assistant Secretary of State of Near Eastern Affairs, Ann Patterson, was in Geneva, Switzerland yesterday to discuss with the UN and with members of the Permanent Five of the UN Security Council how we can facilitate implementation of UNSCR 2254. This is the one that was signed right before the holidays, as you know, which codified the Vienna process at the UN. In both meetings, the U.S. delegation focused particularly on the need to gain sustained unimpeded access for the delivery of humanitarian relief supplies. All areas under siege should have access to relief, as we talked about. Also, as we talked about, we believe, and it was stressed in this meeting, that the ISSG members, all of them, have an obligation to continue to press all parties to grant that access immediately. The U.S. delegation also pressed on the need for constructive talks to begin on the 25th of January between the Syrian parties on a genuine political transition in accordance with the Geneva Communique. I'm almost done. I know you probably have seen our media note, but I do want to reiterate it here from the podium that Deputy Secretary of State Antony Blinken will travel later this week to Japan, to Burma, to South Korea, and to China to consult with U.S. allies in the region and our partners and to see firsthand progress in Burma's post-election democratic transition. He'll conduct the interim strategic security dialogue with the Chinese government and discuss a range of other regional and global issues. This is the Deputy Secretary's third visit to Northeast Asia in the last 11 months and his second trip to Burma. Again, we've put more detail out in our media notes, so I'll spare you those details right now. Matt, over to you.
Oh, I thought you had more.
Well, let's just add one more.
Yeah. Let's start with Iran. And before going into the implementation day guessing game, I want to talk about the sailors incident again and to ask you whether or not the U.S. government writ large, coming from the Pentagon, has made a determination about whether these sailors were mistreated in any way, and if if it has made that determination, what you're going to do about it.
I don't know that such a determination has been made. I know that the Navy in particular is doing an inquiry on this, as they should, and we need to let that process go forward. I'm not aware that any final determinations about causation or about the ultimate manner of interaction with the IRGC or the Iranian Navy has been made.
All right. Do you know if there's been any further contact between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif?
I don't have any additional communication to read out to you. I don't believe that there's been anything additional with respect to this incident.
Okay. And then to implementation day, what is going on here? The Iranians say that they've almost finished, that the Calandria is out, that the core has been filled with concrete, and that the IAEA is looking at it right now to verify it. I mean, is it possible that this is going to happen tomorrow, or is that now out of the question, and we're looking at either the weekend or sometime next week?
I honestly can't tell you exactly when implementation day will occur. What I can tell you is that we believe it will occur, and that it will occur very soon. And as soon as we have a better sense of what that is, when it is, we'll certainly tell you. But I don't have additional detail today.
Can you confirm, I mean, as you saw yesterday, the Secretary said that the Calandria was out and he expected it to be filled with concrete in the coming hours, and you saw what Matt said about the Iranian comments. From your knowledge, has the concrete been poured?
I know that they have taken those steps with respect to shutting it down, and that includes the pouring of concrete. So yes, we believe that concrete has been poured and applied. I don't know what the status of that process is, and what I can tell you definitively, as you and I speak here today, that we're not at implementation right now, but that everybody is working towards it. And again, to Matt's question, I believe that we will get there, and that we'll get there very soon.
And when you say we're not at implementation day yet, is that because the Iranians have, to your knowledge, yet to take every step that they need to take that then needs to be verified, or have they done all their steps?
Well, that's for the IAEA to determine. What kicks off implementation is their certification that Iran has met all its steps as required. And as you and I speak here right now, I can't say that they have, and neither is the IAEA saying that. I think we are very close. I would prefer not to get into any more detail than that, but I do think we're very close. And as soon as we know something definitively, we'll let you know. I suspect, the first word will come from, as appropriately, come from the IAEA.
Can I ask you about the U.S. government getting ready? You're talking about what the Iran has to do to get to implementation day, but the U.S. has some things to do too, and that is offer guidance to U.S. companies and businesses and about which sanctions are being lifted and which ones are not, and how the U.S. government is preparing to move ahead with this. Is that done?
We are moving ahead to meet all our commitments as well, and without getting into great specific detail, what I can tell you is that we will be ready as well on implementation day to fully implement our side and all our commitments. But I don't have more information right now.
Does there have to be a configuration of officials in one city to receive the IAE report, or could they just announce it?
I think
Out of Vienna.
that's a little bit cart before the horse right now. There's still some work that has to be done. I don't have additional detail right now with respect to the physical look of it and how it's going to be when we get there, what it's going to look like. The key piece of it, in fact, the most critical piece of it is the IAEA certifying that Iran has met all
But if
its
they receive the
requirements.
report in
But
Vienna, can they just then
there
announce
are
it
a number
there?
of documents that have to be signed and approved by all parties, and
Yeah.
as far as I know, that is not that process has not been completed. So we're just not there yet. I do think we're very close. Excuse me, and when we can talk more about it, we certainly will.
You're not prepared to say whether he's coming back tomorrow or anything like that?
I have nothing additional on the secretary's schedule to announce or to speak to today.
If I could, I wanted to go to around where Matt started with the Navy and the sailors, and ask you, Admiral, what the sailors should have done. We understand that they were picked up in Iranian territory, so they were already sort of where they weren't supposed to be. The Secretary Carter said as much today, that they know that they shouldn't have been there. So when approached by Iranian forces, guns drawn, what are these sailors trained to do? Are they supposed to allow themselves to be boarded, or are they supposed to defend themselves before they allow that to happen?
Those kinds of decisions are made in the moment, and there's really only one individual that can explain the decisions that he made, and that in this case I believe it's the young officer who was in charge. And I know the Navy is talking to him as well as the other sailors, and I'm not going to get ahead of any judgments that the Navy might make, or try to get in the head of that young man. Every tactical situation is different, and it would be foolhardy and inappropriate for me to try to second guess or armchair quarterback what could have happened, should have happened, what he should have done. I wouldn't get into that level of detail. I sailed those waters myself a long time ago, but even then, it was tense, specifically with Iran, and everybody's mindful of the tensions up there in the North Arabian Gulf, and you can see just from looking at the videos that the tension comes right through. But I would really not want to try to second guess this. That's for the Navy and to determine, and we need to let them do that.
Has anybody expressed any dismay directly to the Iranians about the video, which is largely seen at this point as propaganda? Secretary Carter said the U.S. would have never done anything like that had the roles been reversed. In producing that video with the sailors with their hands up, sort of
Yeah.
a propaganda.
Well, look, I mean,
video.
I obviously it's when the video on the face of it is it's difficult to watch, and there's no question about that, and nobody likes to see our sailors in that position. I can't speak for the motivations for why they did it, why they put it out there. If they did it for propaganda purposes, we would certainly join in those that are expressing concerns about that. I mean, that's that's less than helpful. I do know it's not uncommon for them, just from past experience, it's not uncommon for them to document events and incidents like this. You might remember when the British sailors were captured a few years ago, they did the same thing, so it's not uncommon. But to put it out there and use it as propaganda, obviously we wouldn't condone that. So what's most important here, though, and I don't want it to get lost, and I understand there's questions about what happened and who's accountable and, you know, what we think about their behavior. But we got our sailors back in less than 24 hours. And nobody got hurt. And not a shot got fired. And they're all safe. And we got our boats back too. And I don't want that to get lost in the discussion over this incident. The Navy's going to do an inquiry. They'll figure out, as they always do, what happened. And if something didn't happen that should have, if somebody made a mistake, I can guarantee you the Navy will do what they need to do to hold people accountable, if it comes to that. And I'm not prejudging. But let's not lose the bigger picture here. Because the last time something like this happened, it took months to get those sailors freed from the British sailors. Whether you agree with the Iran deal or not, and I know there's people that don't, whether you agree with Iran sitting at the table at the ISSG as we work through a political process in Syria or not, there's no denying that the dialogue that's been opened up with Iran and the relationship that Secretary Kerry has been able to forge with Foreign Minister Zarif as a result of those issues helped open up a channel, direct channel, to get United States Navy sailors home in less, or not home, but back to their unit in less than 24 hours. And I really, really think it's important for us to remember that.
I don't think anyone's lost sight of that, or anyone is saying that that's fundamentally wrong. The question is that, as you noted, this has happened before, and this is a pattern that the Iranians have shown. They've stormed embassies, including very recently,
Yeah.
just on New Year's Eve.
Sure.
They took these British sailors. They fired these ballistic missiles. They fired missiles near U.S. ships in the Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz,
Right.
and then this latest incident. So the issue is not whether or not there is this dialogue or this channel of communication is opened up, and whether that's potentially good or played a very helpful role in securing these guys' release. The question is the pattern of behavior by the Israelis. And when you say
the
that,
Iranians.
I mean, sorry, the Iranians.
If I had
yes.
said that.
Yes, if you had said that,
boy,
there would have
the
been,
flags have flown.
there would have been hell to pay. Yes, there might even be hell to pay for me for saying that. So sorry, let me just make clear. The
I'm
question
glad that
is,
I can help bail you out of trouble.
yes.
today.
Well, I tried. The question is the behavior of the Iranians and the pattern of behavior of the Iranians. And when you say that producing this video is less than helpful, I mean, or that it to put it out there
To
as
be used for propaganda purposes
right,
is
right.
certainly less
We
than
wouldn't
helpful.
condone that, but isn't it much more than that? Can't you say much? Well, can't you go further? I mean, isn't this a kind of a violation of the rules of engagement?
This is something I wanted to ask you about, which is under the Geneva Conventions. I believe it is not permissible to video or produce for propaganda purposes or display prisoners of war. And I guess my question was, do you regard the 10, and I got to assume you don't, the 10 sailors as having been prisoners of war to whom the Geneva Conventions are applicable, or not, because you're not actually at war with Iran, and therefore, they didn't actually violate any international agreements by videoing them and displaying that?
Yeah, and look, the Geneva Convention applies for wartime. We're not at war with Iran, so it's a moot question. But I do want to challenge just a little bit. I do want to challenge a little bit your preamble, your really lengthy, eloquent preamble.
Well, not so eloquent, because I got the name of the country wrong.
Well, I was trying to save you again, man. I'm not suggesting that when I talked about we need to keep in mind that we got our sailors back so quickly. And I'm not suggesting that people are criticizing that. What I am suggesting is that that element of this is being forgotten. It's being largely overlooked. And if we,
Front page of the New York Times
it's
today.
being
And the Washington
overlooked
Post.
by many. And I can but think and imagine that if here we were 2 or 3 days afterward, if they were still in custody, what kind of criticism and questions we'd be getting. So I just think it's an important element not to forget that we got them home safe and sound, 10 figures, 10 toes, no shots fired, and we got our boats back too. Not insignificant. So I just wanted to make that point. I'm not suggesting that there aren't other valid questions being asked, such as those you did over Iranian behavior. And what I would say to that, Matt, is, look, and I've said it 100 times, that we're not turning a blind eye to Iran and its provocative behavior. We're not forgetting that they fired rockets near an aircraft carrier not long ago, that they still are a state sponsor of terrorism. I mean, this isn't about some rapprochement with Iran. This is about getting sailors back.
Right, but when you say it's not insignificant, I mean, you're praising the Iranians for doing what they should have done anyway, regardless of whether there was this open channel of communication. I mean, a responsible state with a responsible Navy and military force, such as, say, the United States. If this had been, would Foreign Minister Zarif, in the opposite situation, do you see a situation where Foreign Minister Zarif would have had to urgently get on the phone with Secretary Kerry and say, "Oh my God, help! Please release our sailors." I mean, I'm just not sure that would ever happen. So you're saying that this channel of communication has led to a point where you can call the Iranians to ask them, appeal to them to do what they should do, even without that channel of communication. No?
Well, this is a fair, but this is a regime that has had a history of not doing many things that it should do, right?
Exactly,
I mean, this
which is what a lot of people
we're
point
not
out
denying
when
that.
they.
No, and this isn't about praise. The secretary did not praise Iran. He thanked Iranian authorities for their ability to work a diplomatic release here. There's a difference between expressing gratitude for the cooperation to get our guys back and lauding and praising. There was no lauding or praising. Again, nobody, certainly not the secretary, is unmindful of the continued tensions that exist between the United States and Iran.
Could argue that you guys are now
Words very close to implementation day, when, if the IAEA certifies it, you then remove a huge raft of sanctions on the Iranians. Do you think that you're going to have the same kind of cooperation from the Iranians if this happens after implementation day?
I couldn't possibly answer that. It's a hypothetical.
Yep.
With
Do
the
you think
Iran deal was
implementation day had anything to do with their eagerness to give your sailors back when they haven't done it in the past because they're desperate to get access to billions of dollars in frozen
I think
assets?
I can't speak for the Iranian government and what ultimately was behind their motivation to acquiesce to our very urgent request. They did, and that's all that matters. They can speak to that, but I think it's beyond dispute that as a result of working through the Iran deal and now on Syria, that we have a dialogue, and we're able to have a dialogue on issues sometimes of mutual concern, and there has been a sort of a building of momentum of this ability to have a dialogue. But where it goes after implementation, I think that's on the Iranians, and it's up to them to determine how much they want to make use of this historic moment to become more responsible and productive members not only of the region but of the global community. That's on them. Were it to have that effect, not that was the intention of the Iran deal, the intention was to cut off their pathways, right? But would it have that effect? I think that would be a positive outcome, and the Secretary's spoken to that.
My question is, you keep praising the importance of the channel, and I understand that it is useful to have foreign minister to foreign minister contacts with a country with which you have been estranged for so many decades. But why do you ascribe causality to the fact that you have this channel, as opposed to, for example, the fact that you are about to hand them huge economic benefits in exchange for their nuclear actions?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but we're not handing them.
The question is, why do you think, you keep talking about how important the channel is, but my question is, well, gee, isn't it perfectly conceivable that what was really important here is the fact that
Oh,
they're
I see.
about to get a whole bunch
see.
of economic
Sure.
benefits
Sure.
for actions you
And-
wanted them to take, and that maybe
That could
that's
have
why
been,
they did
that could
this?
have been behind their motivation. I don't know. I don't know. Only they can speak to that. But I also think, on a technical issue, if you don't mind, nobody's handing them some sort of windfall of cash. This is their money that comes in sanctions relief, if and only if they meet all their requirements under the JCPOA, and that was, and again, the sanctions were in place to get them to do exactly that. So, it's a technical point. It's not your question, but I do think it's important to state it, because that narrative keeps coming back now as we get closer to implementation day. As for their motivation, again, I think they should speak to that. Here at the State Department, we're just glad that diplomacy worked in this case and that we were able to get our sailors back safe and sound.
John, speaking of diplomacy, the fact that the Secretary of State had to get involved in something that was technically a military-to-military issue, in the debrief that these sailors are undergoing, would there be any reason for anyone from the embassy in Kuwait, if that's where they are being debriefed, or anyone from the political military bureau to be involved in the debrief to find out exactly who was holding them and what kind of contact they had? Or is this something that the military can handle by itself?
I don't know who's involved in debriefing the sailors. Obviously, the Navy is clearly running this as they should. Who else is in the room? I couldn't begin to tell you. It's not a State Department function.
Wouldn't it be important, though, given that the people that were holding them belong to a state with which the U.S. does not have diplomatic relations?
I don't know. I don't know what the debriefing that's a question for the Navy and the Defense Department. I don't know who's in the room. The State Department is not in charge of that process. I can't say definitively that who's in or who's not in the room. What's more important is that the Navy gets the information they need to do the inquiry and to figure out what happened and how to keep it from happening again. That's the most important thing. You talked about mill to mill. There is no mill to mill relationship with Iran. There are no, as you rightly pointed out, there's no diplomatic relations with Iran. The only channel that exists right now is between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif. So, in terms of
That didn't involve Secretary Kerry.
direct bilateral contacts and communications are primarily through the two foreign ministers. There's no official diplomatic relations, and there is no mill-to-mill relationship with them. So, to your other question, was it somehow askew that the State Department had to get involved in here? I mean, not at all. Not at all. In fact, it was the most effective channel to use, and it worked.
And then also,
Working very closely in a very, well, not closely together, but in a very close geographical proximity
Who
to each
is?
other. The Americans and the Iranians in that
For a
region.
very long time.
For a very long time. Is there should there be a mill-to-mill contact and relations where they can actually talk to each other directly to diffuse these kind of situations?
You'd have to talk to the Defense Department about the military relationships. Typically, they mirror diplomatic relationships. It's not typically common for us to not, to not have diplomatic relations, and yet for the military to be able to have their own relations. That's just not the way it's done. But specifically, with respect to the military relationship, you'd have to talk to the Defense Department. What I can tell you, I mean, it's not a relationship, but obviously we communicate with Iranian naval forces almost every day in the Gulf. We did when I was a young ensign out there in 1988, and I'm sure they're doing it still today, just over radio, just to deconflict and to make sure that intentions are known. Most of those interactions are professional, and some are unprofessional, such as what we saw with the rocket attacks them firing rockets off of small boats near an aircraft carrier, and we called it like we saw it. We stated our concerns about it, but it's not that's not a relationship thing. That's mariner to mariner communications.
Well, what's preventing these? I guess, I mean, you're saying that the military to military relationship follow a diplomatic
Typically, yeah.
relationship. What's preventing that from happening?
There's no diplomatic relations with Iran. There are no diplomatic relations with Iran. But I won't speak to decisions that the Pentagon may or may not make. I'm not aware that they're anticipating or predicting or hoping for. That's up to them to speak to.
John, how will these footages, do you think, affect the U.S. image in the Middle East, especially in the eyes of its friends and enemies? The U.S. is fighting ISIS in the Middle East and supporting its allies.
So is the question that because we had sailors on their knees on boats with guns pointed at them, that somehow we need to be worried that there's an image of weakness? Is that the question?
Don't you think that it will
Name
affect
another
the U.S.
country
image?
in the world that has as many forces in the Middle East than the United States. None. Who's been a naval presence there since the end of World War II? None. The United States, I'm talking about another nation outside the region, and they don't have as big a military as the United States. We have remained perennially there. We will. There's a robust military presence. It's not going to go away. We are deeply engaged in the fight against ISIL and the coalition. And nobody can say that the United States is not contributing to that effort, but also leading in the coalition and put that 65-member coalition together. So I've heard the snarking about this. I think it's really important, unless you've been on one of those boats and you've sailed in those waters and you've been faced with that danger, not to second guess what those sailors did in the moment that they did it. That's for the Navy to figure out, and they'll do that. As I said, nobody likes to see that video. We don't enjoy watching it here either. And I'm sure the Navy's not enjoying watching it. But let them work through this and figure out what happened, and then we'll go from there. Our focus here at the State Department is on reinforcing strong diplomacy in the region on a spate of so many issues. And there's a lot to tackle, and the Secretary is very focused on that. And we're glad that through diplomatic means we were able to get this resolved as quickly and as safely as we did.
In one of your answers to Arshad on this is a purely legal kind of question.
Oh,
You
then
said,
I'm sure I'm going to be a master.
well, I'm just wondering if you said that since we're not quote unquote at war with Iran, that the Geneva Conventions are moot. And
The question
is
was
that
moot. I didn't say the conventions are moot.
no? Well, that the question is moot
Doesn't apply.
whether they apply. Okay, has that determination actually been made, as far as you know? Has it been a determination that?
I don't know that I don't know that it needs to be applied. I'm not a lawyer, but it's very clear if you read the conventions, they are for wartime, and we're not at war with Iran. So, as far as I know,
At least
moot.
in the technical sense, but you have proxies fighting in numerous
We're
places.
not at war with Iran.
Fair enough. When the British sailors were taken, and you mentioned this incident several times, the former Prime Minister of your oldest, or not oldest, but your special relationship ally, Prime Minister Blair, said that the release of the video of them, which you also mentioned, was a violation of the Geneva Convention.
I can't speak for what Prime Minister Blair said back then. I could just tell you what our
Okay, so the administration does not believe that the rules of the rules and the code of conduct laid out in the conventions is applicable in this case. But
If we're not at war with Iran, so it's hard to see how the Geneva Convention could apply to that.
all right,
If we were, or if it did apply, then we would certainly have, we would be able to apply concerns about it under that means. But we're not at war with Iran.
well, okay, fair enough. But I mean, don't you think that the broadcasting of this this video and these photographs, if not violating an international convention, is at least a breach of what should be kind of a professional military code of conduct that should have some kind of a consequence?
Well, I certainly would agree that it's unhelpful, and we wouldn't consider it appropriate to do. It's not going to do anything to de-escalate tensions. and its use for propaganda purposes is inappropriate. So I think we can safely say that. Nobody wants to see that.
Yeah, there's going to be elections in Iran and in the United States over the next 12 months. There won't be Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif after a while. At the moment, it's a one-to-one relationship. Has there been any thought given to?
How do you know that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Did
All right.
you- but
It's possible that there will not be. Has there been any
now
thought
I know
given
why you
to
didn't win the Powerball.
institutionalize the relationship? Obviously, I'm not asking you if you can ever restore diplomatic relations, but what's the procedure to keep this kind of, as you've said, useful, in this case, contact open in the event that one or other of these men is no longer in a job in 12 months' time?
I can't possibly predict what the future is going to look like.
Well, exactly. So shouldn't there be an institutional structure, or at least a post-it note with a mobile number on it? You know, hand on this relationship, such as it is, to institutionally between the foreign ministry of
Well, that gets
Iran
to the
and
whole
Secretary.
issue of official institutionalized diplomatic relations, and we have none, and I'm not aware of any plan to restore.
But you've described the relationship as it exists now as useful in this case.
It certainly was.
That's a useful thing you have that you could lose.
I can't deny that might be the case, but absent a U.S. government decision to restore diplomatic relations, I don't know how else to answer that question. It has been a useful channel in this particular case, certainly very useful. Decisions about elections here and decisions about elections there are up to the people of those countries, and they get to make those decisions. And the impact that those decisions have on whatever relationship there is with Iran going forward is, I think, yet to be determined. And it would be foolhardy to try to predict that. Yeah.
Very quickly. Did you say that the Geneva Convention applies to this incident, or it doesn't? Because there is no state of war. I'm trying to understand.
The Geneva Convention applies for a time of war between nations.
Right.
And we're not at war with Iran. So it's
Right.
difficult to see how the provisions of the Geneva Convention can be applied here, or us citing them as violations of it when we're not at war with Iran. Now, if we were at war with Iran, or will you pick the country, then yes, I think you could look at what happened as a breach of the protocols in there, but they don't apply.
Okay. And very quickly, the incident itself, some people say that it reflects some sort of conflict, or maybe between, let's say, the Revolutionary Guard on the one hand, and then President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif on the other. Do you also have the same feeling that there is actually some sort of a conflict or power struggle between the Revolutionary Guard and the executive in this case, President Rouhani and it?
I'm not an expert on internal Iranian politics. I mean, it's a simple fact that not all arms of the government agree with one another, and not all of them act in unanimity or consensus, and not all of them, as far as we know, keep each other informed of everything they're doing. That shouldn't come as a shock to anybody. We have our own struggles in the United States with that. But I, with respect to this particular incident, I have no knowledge of the internal communications over it in Tehran, and how they dealt with it, or prepared for it, or ultimately got to resolution. What I do know is that, Foreign Minister Zarif, he certainly worked on the diplomatic end of it.
And finally, it's
Secretary
always the
Kerry
JCPO.
Was Zarif already aware of the incident, or did Kerry inform him?
I
that
don't
it
know.
happened?
I don't know.
Yeah, on the Iran deal itself, it is always stated that it is independent of everything else. Yet it was cited by the Secretary of State himself that because of the JCPOA, the agreement, there were lines of communications that basically helped to bring this incident to
there's
an
no
end. So
question
it
about
is
that.
related to other issues, isn't it?
No, there's no question about it that it provided a channel now that we could take advantage of. But that was never the intent. I mean, there's a ancillary benefits. I'm not arguing that. And as we've said before, if the Iran deal itself were to lead to a change in behavior and conduct by Iran to make them more productive, more responsible in the region, then that's a good thing. And we wouldn't walk away from that if that's the outcome. I don't think we're there yet. We certainly haven't seen a change in their behavior in the region at all. But if it happens, and it happens because of the channel opened up or the cooperation that is represented in the Iran deal, that's a benefit, not just to the Iranian people, but to the region. As for there's no question that the deal allowed for a channel of discussion and dialogue to exist between Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif, but it would be wrong to conclude that we entered into the Iran deal with the intention of doing that, of having that. The whole purpose of entering into the deal was to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to cut off the pathways to a nuclear weapons program in Iran. And when we get to implementation day, which we will have achieved that goal.
Let me just raise one more point.
If you have this issue with the Geneva Convention, if the Geneva Convention doesn't apply because we're not at war with Iran, then are there any international conventions that do apply in this situation?
I'm not an international law expert. I don't know. I would refer you to the Navy and the Defense Department for how, for what applies here. We don't have, like a naval treaty or an incidents at sea agreement like we had with the Soviet Navy many years ago that would sort of govern behavior in these incidents. We don't have that with Iran, so I'm not aware of any other legal framework.
Going back to David's question about some sort of institution, the whole notion of a possible rapprochement with Tehran, Syria is a state sponsor of terror. And even though the U.S. and Syria don't have ambassadors in either country at the moment, they still have a technically open diplomatic relationship. How does the U.S. talk to Syria about issues, even though you don't have ambassadors in the same place? And why couldn't whatever is being done to communicate with Damascus, why couldn't that be replicated with Iran, excuse me?
I don't know what the framework is. It's not uncommon for us to have protecting powers that can represent our interests.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know what the framework is with respect to Iran. You got me on that one. All I know is that Secretary Kerry had a channel with Foreign Minister Zarif, and he used it, and it worked. I'm just not an expert on, on how that exists in every other nation with which we don't have diplomatic relations. As I understand it, it varies from country to country. Yeah.
A quick follow-up on the phone call between Secretary Kerry and Lavrov. Do they agree to meet next week in Zurich, as reported by the Russian Foreign Ministry?
I reported it myself just when I started the press conference. Were you not here for the beginning?
I'm glad to clarify.
It only feels like an hour.
No. It feels quite different from an hour.
Yes.
43 minutes.
As I said at the opening, I'll save you from having to go look at the transcript. They're going to meet on the 20th in Zurich.
Iraq?
Yes.
Thank you. So, Kurdish government delegation is in Washington, D.C., and they have reportedly met with officials here at this building. Can you tell us what officials did they meet? And is it true that they have sought financial assistance and debt from the United States?
Hang on a second. Don't know that I have a readout on this for you. You're gonna have to let me take that question. I don't have any readouts.
Okay.
Though when you do that, whether or not even if a decision hasn't been made on helping them financially overcome their deficit, whether or not this is even being considered as an option, there's some kind of direct assistance to the Kurdish Authority.
Yeah, let me take that question. I'm sorry, I should have been prepared for that.
There's one more question. There was an editorial today in the New York Times warning of the possible ramifications of this budget dispute between Baghdad and Erbil if they they're allowed to drag on. I remember Brett McGurk was very active at some point in 2014 and 15, helping mediate the dispute, but we don't see that kind of mediation anymore from the United States, at least in public. Why is that?
We've been, I'm not sure I understand the
I
question.
mean, we don't, the problem is still there, and we don't see a U.S. government
What problem is there?
representative.
The government issue?
The dispute over budget and oil between KRG and Baghdad.
We are in constant touch with Kurdish and Iraqi authorities about those issues. I mean, though we may not talk about it every day, and you're not seeing press releases about it, doesn't mean that we're not engaged and continue to engage with the leadership over there. And Brett McGurk obviously continues to be involved as appropriate. I don't have anything new to announce or to additional context to provide you, but to surmise that we've somehow disengaged from it, I think would be wholly inaccurate.
But can we say the fact that it's dragged on for about 3 years that show the United States it has not used its leverage on both parties that to
These
solve
are
that issue?
internal political issues that we want those leaders to resolve and to work through. We've said that time and time again, and I've answered this question from you before. It's not about using American leverage and influence and and putting a thumb on it. It's about encouraging constant engagement and dialogue, and to help them get to solutions that they arrive at and that they agree to. And nothing's changed about our desire to see them to do exactly that. And that you may not be hearing about it every day, or we may not be talking about it every day, doesn't mean that it's not happening.
On Iran and Korea.
Oh, Saeed, I already got you a bunch of times. Let me
North
go to these
Korea.
guys.
Turkey.
Okay, we'll stay on Iraq.
Very quickly, there are reports that the Shia militia, Al-Hashd al-Shabi, is besieging Sunni villages and so on. And in some instances, they're committing some horrific acts and so on. Are you aware that the Sunni villages in the Diyala area have been besieged by
I haven't seen those specific reports. We've long made known our concerns, though, about the proper treatment of innocent civilians by all parties in Iraq. We've been very clear about that. Working hard. That's one of the reasons why we're working so hard to support the Abadi government in their efforts to be inclusive and to help improve the competence and capability not just of primarily the Iraqi security forces, but also the various militias that are out there. I think you guys got a briefing on this or had a chance to talk to Colonel Warren about some of those efforts. And so, I mean, we're very, very committed to that. I'm not aware of those particular reports. That's really more of a question for the Defense Department to speak to. Yeah.
So ahead of Deputy Secretary Blinken's travel to Asia, and earlier this week, Japan, the Japanese foreign minister talked to Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia, and Russia seemed to be very forthcoming in terms of support for sanctions against North Korea and working with the international community. Is there any concern that Beijing would not be as forthcoming with such support?
What I would say is we've been very consistent in our message to Beijing that we want them to continue to use their influence and exert their leadership in the region to hold the North accountable for their provocative behavior. We've also said that at least in light of this most recent test, nuclear test by the North, we continue to believe that the international community's got to be in unanimity about moving forward with tougher measures to include tougher sanctions. And as Secretary Kerry said to you himself, that the past approach that China's employed hasn't been working, and that we're going to look to China to exert its influence and its leadership in a more positive way with respect to holding the North accountable. I can't predict where that's going to go. Those discussions are ongoing, and we'll have to see where we end up. Okay? Yeah.
Secretary Kerry and I guess others at the Pentagon have, long raised concerns about ISIL affiliates. Why is there anything you could say about the timing? Why now? I would presume they would have been on your radar. The announcement says they were formed in January 2015, so I presume they'd been on your radar for a while.
Certainly, we've been watching them for a while. The why now is we have conducted enough analysis to make this determination and to make it public. I wouldn't read anything into the timing with respect to current events there or here or even events here in Washington. This is a fairly standard, routine, deliberate process that we go through in terms of designating FTOs, and this was the time to announce this one, and so we did. There's nothing more behind it than that.
Okay, do you not think there's enough acronyms in this war? ISIL K, ISIS K, Daesh K.
It's nice and concise, isn't it? It's clear. ISIL K.
ISIL K.
Yeah.
ISIL?
Okay.
Are we good? Yeah, there's more.
Oh.
Okay, we'll go to these three and then. No, I already got you, man. You're killing it. Go ahead.
There are reports out that the CDC may issue a warning about people traveling to the Caribbean and Latin American countries because of the spreading of the Zika virus. Has there been any consideration in this department about a travel warning based on?
I don't have any travel warnings to speak to right now. I mean, obviously, we're in close touch with the CDC on this. We're very mindful of this particular virus and the danger posed by it. But what I can tell you is we're going to stay in close touch with the CDC. I won't get ahead of any announcements they may or may not make. That's for them to speak to. We're in close touch with authorities there, and obviously, if we feel the need that we need to make such notifications here at the State Department, we'll do that. But I don't have any that I can speak to right now. But we are watching this very, very closely.
Taiwan?
Yes.
What are your expectations for the Taiwanese elections on Saturday? And there have been concerns that of cross-strait relations being affected, and thereby how would this affect U.S. policy?
Well, we don't get. We're not going to talk about the internal politics in the country. We would expect, like we expect other elections, that the Taiwanese people are able to express their views through the ballot box, and that that they're fair and transparent. But that's about all we would say about that.
Okay, and can I also follow up on?
I know what you're going to say. You don't talk about the internal politics of other countries. I know, you were going to get me on that. I can see your face when I said
Taiwan is not a country.
I can say, as soon as I say something like that, and he looks up from his scribbling, then I know I'm going to get it.
Taiwan is not a country.
No, I didn't. Yes, I said.
You said.
Nothing has changed about our one China policy.
So.
And that's the country I was talking about.
China.
But these elections are for the Taiwanese people to speak to.
Right, but in other countries.
One China, one China, one China. Turkey? There's no change to our policy.
Sorry, can I also ask about Assistant Secretary Blinken's travel? He's traveling to Northeast Asia. What do you expect out of these meetings?
Well, I think we put a lot of that in the media note that we put out. He's looking, and I said it at the top. He's going to discuss a wide range of bilateral regional issues to include the tensions, obviously, that continue to exist in the region in the South China Sea and Northeast Asia with North Korea and their provocative actions. So, I mean, there's a lot to talk about out there, obviously, as there always is, and it's a reinforcement of our commitment to the region and our commitment to the Asia-Pacific rebalance. As I said, this is it's not unusual for him to travel out there, and I suspect you'll continue to see us engage very directly with leaders in the region.
And Secretary Kerry didn't mention Asia in his 2016 foreign policy goals. What does this mean for the rebalance?
That he didn't mention it, it means nothing to the rebalance. The rebalance is still a vital part of our foreign policy agenda going into this year, as it has been in past years. And I wouldn't read anything into what is or is not on, on a list that the secretary puts out. Are you talking about the top 10 list that they put out after the?
No, his remarks at the National Defense University.
Yeah, look, I mean that he mentioned he did mention the Asia
Well,
Pacific in that
Asia.
he did mention the Asia Pacific in that speech, and he did mention specifically the TPP. It was mentioned, and but regardless of how many words were applied to it, absolutely doesn't change one bit our full and total commitment to realizing the rebalance and to focusing on that region. And as I just said at the top, the Deputy Secretary himself is making yet another trip out to the region to reinforce that. And I suspect you'll see in the near future the Secretary himself travel to the region. And when we get to a point where we can talk with more specificity about that, we will. Yeah. Last one today.
Okay. On this PKK bomb attack in Diyarbakir, you said U.S. stands with Turkey against the terror. I think there are some U.S. policies that might contradict with this statement. For example, 2 weeks ago, Syrian Kurdish group PID leader Salih Muslim told El-Quds newspaper that hundreds of PKK militants fighting in YPG ranks against ISIS. Currently, U.S. special advisors are assisting YPG-led Syrian opposition forces. So basically, U.S. special forces seem assisting these PKK fighters too. Are you aware that there are PKK fighters in YPG ranks?
I don't have, the identification cards of everybody in the YPD. We are Kurdish fighters that are proving effective against ISIL. We're going to continue to support them as best we can.
But
That's
his
not
leader
new.
says that PKK...
That's not new. And the PKK is a designated foreign terrorist organization. We've made clear our concerns about this group. That's not new. So there's nothing new here.
But his leader confesses for the first time that there are PKK fighters in YPG ranks.
Who's confessing? I haven't seen that.
Salih Muslim, the PID leader.
I haven't seen that. PKK is a foreign terrorist organization. Nothing's changed about our position on that. And yes, there are Kurdish fighters who are proving effective against ISIL, and nothing's changed about our commitment to helping them continue to press the fight against a group which I think all of us can agree is generally a bad thing for the region, certainly for the people of Iraq and for Syria. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a great day.